So the discussion that we're going to talk about today is really about clinical value in biologics. And as was just described, there are so many different biologic options with various different price ranges from essentially free to very, very expensive. So we're going to have a little bit of discussion specifically in spine about the options with all of them. So first of all, just a little one slide, or maybe two slides on who is C-Spine. C-Spine's a small spine company. We're based out of Carlsbad, California, so just north of San Diego. As a spine company, maybe 1 or 2% market share, so maybe the 10th largest spine company. But what's really unique about us is that we're about a 50-50 split on the spinal implant side and biologics. So we have a very big focus on biologics. We have our own tissue bank. We manufacture our own biologics in-house. And we're currently the 3rd largest DBM supplier. So while we're a small spine company, we're actually a fairly large player in the biologic space. Our mission, just to show you how serious we are about clinical value, and I highlighted a key point in the vision, that we seek to be a market share taker by driving improved procedural solutions that combine efficient spinal instrumentation with industry-leading orthobiologics to deliver clinical value. So it's very important to us that we are providing that value. So what we're seeing is really the tide is shifting towards clinical value these days, and the hypothesis of this talk is as there are more advancements with interbody cages, plus we have high-performing DBMs and tissue-based products, it leads to a reduced requirement for the really expensive products, the 3-letter word we talked about, and cellular-based products as well, which overall provides us with an increased clinical value. So just a historical perspective on various interbody cages, and you can see a lot of these that have been very successful over the years, from carbon fiber cages to standard titanium cages, cages made from bone, cages made from PEEK. A lot of different varieties. These would be considered your sort of standard or historical cages. Where we are at today have been a lot of advances where we look at PEEK that's coated in titanium under various different methods. We now have porous-based PEEK. We have 3D printed titanium, and we also have expandable titanium cages. So when we look at all these different cages and the options they provide, it really begs the question of if we have to change our spinal procedures and if there is a change required for our biologic usage. Especially with expandable cages that introduce a new element of potential gaps inside the end plate. So where we're at today with these advancements, it really means that cages are no longer just spaces. They're not just considered inert materials to hold open the disc space. They are truly participating in the fusion now. Therefore, the burden on the biologics is reduced, and what I'm going to argue is that there will be a shift away from infuse. It's a high cost, high risk, but also known efficacy. Right? So the argument is that this would be reserved for the most challenging cases only. And a shift away from cellular bone matrices. These are also high cost, but in comparison to BMP, the efficacy is unknown, right? So this leads us to a questionable value proposition. And then of course my statement will be that we shift towards high performance DBMs. If we look at the cost, approximate cost, for say a 10cc or equivalent, infuse is going to look around $3,500 for a medium kit. A cellular bone matrix is about $3,500. But DBMs are much more cost effective in the $1,000 to $2,000 range. So you can see a really massive range in prices from different products. So with cellular bone matrices, and you can see on the screen how many there are now, almost every major spine company outside of Medtronic has a cellular bone matrix product. C-Spine, we also do not have a cellular bone matrix product. But there's at least 15 or 16 new products on the market now. And the first of them to be launched happened in 2005. So we're now in 2018, last time I checked, and still looking for the data to determine, is it science or is it still just hype? So the tide is going out, I believe.
Bondi Beach.
Yeah, I think that's somewhere in Europe, actually. I should have put Bondi Beach there. But the market dynamics aren't necessarily caught up to this yet. This is a market that is growing. Part of the reason is these products are very expensive, and major industry players like DePuy, for example, have recently had success in this space. So the cellular bone matrix segment is a growing segment. But we're going to argue that the tide is going out, and the reason for that is the lack of data. So basic science with cell-based products can confirm that those cells, once they are defrosted, and I should back up for those who aren't familiar with these products, cellular bone matrices contain a viable cell component. They are cryopreserved, stored at minus 80 degrees Celsius. When you receive them in the OR, you'll thaw them out. It takes about 20 minutes to thaw, and then they're ready for use. What the basic science data tells us, fairly unequivocally, is after that freeze-thaw process, those cells are in fact alive. I can tell you that. They are viable, they are alive. To this point, now 13 years into the history of these products being commercially available, there's still no published data to show that those cells, though they are alive, actually do anything. So no data to isolate that fraction, that cell fraction, and show that it contributes to a higher fusion rate or more bone formation. Compare that to, say, DBMs. I can, because we manufacture our own DBM, I can go in and take a DBM that's an active DBM. I can then deactivate that DBM by removing all the BMPs, test the two side by side, and show you the DBM with BMPs in it is osteoinductive. The DBM without BMPs in it is not inductive. Easy test to do. But that data still does not exist. As we look at clinical data on the cell side, there's more data starting to come out over the years, still very limited, but not convincing. There's one study published by McEnany, which was independently performed outside of any industry partner in 1 and 2 level ACDF, showing fusion results of about 87% by CT at 2 years, compared to a structural allograft cage, which was 95% by CT. Not statistically different, but clearly a trend. Another paper by Eastlack, this one was an evasive study, also showed 87% fusion in 1 and 2 level ACDF at 24 months, which is really not a very impressive result. So there's growing skepticism about these, and there's also a lot of payer pushback and pressure, really based around balancing cost versus data. If you have a high cost, you should have the data to back it up. So moving into C-spine, and I'll get to some of the science stuff, but our whole portfolio, we're very focused on the DBM space. So we are, as I mentioned, the 3rd largest DBM supplier, and what's got us there is we have a different type of DBM technology compared to every other company on the market, and I'll talk a little bit about that. That's called Accell. We put Accell into a variety of different DBM products, and we've just launched various new products in the last couple of months as well that I'll talk about too. So DBM, as we know, cortical bone by itself is not inductive. Cortical bone does, however, have a wide variety of growth factors within it. They're just trapped in the matrix. The way that we make DBMs become inductive is very, very simple. Grind down that cortical bone into bone powder or mill it into fibers, then run it through an acid wash step. Simple hydrochloric acid removes the mineral component, leaves behind collagen and all the growth factors that were natively there. Now when you implant it in the body, those growth factors are available. They can leach out and induce bone formation. So a standard DBM is what you see on the left-hand side. I'm going to try the cursor. Yeah. So here's a standard DBM. Looks like a grain of sand. I won't do that again. It looks like a handful of sand, right? Dense, small chips. And down below it, you see an SEM image of what those chips look like. As you can imagine, if you have a dense chip and growth factors need to leach out of it, because the matrix is dense, the growth factors leach out slowly. On the right-hand side, you see what our Accell technology is. It's light, fluffy. We actually call it in our manufacturing process cotton, and you can see why in the image above. And then the SEM image below it, you see it's highly porous, right? And so the advantage of being highly porous is once you implant it into the body with huge surface area, the growth factors are simply more bioavailable, come out more quickly. And that's what's described in this chart here. This is the release of BMP2 versus time in vitro. So a standard DBM will release the growth factors slowly, but over a sustained period of time, whereas the Accell with the high surface area will have a early release of growth factors and then taper off. This is similar to building a fire, right? When you build a fire, you need the logs to keep you warm throughout the night. That's what provides that energy through the night. But to try to start a fire by holding a match underneath a log is very, very difficult. So what do? We put kindling in the fire. Kindling, compared to a log, it's exactly the same thing, just high surface area. You light the kindling, releases that energy quickly to then get the log going. And that's similar to what we have here. So we combine both these two DBM technologies into the same product to get a biphasic release of growth factors, both early and sustained. We also show, and hopefully you can see this well, we also show that when we test the Accell component and the DBM component, which come from the same donor side by side, we have a higher relative content of growth factors in that Accell component. And I'm not talking 100,000 times more. This is 4 times, about 4x more growth factors in that Accell component compared to the DBM. So as clinicians, when you see DBMs, you tend to see, I use this iceberg analogy, you tend to see what's above the surface, right? You see the procedural solutions, you see the handling, maybe the clinical data that we provide to you. But there's a lot that goes on underneath the surface in the processing as well. As I mentioned, we take cortical bone, we then demineralize it. Sometimes we mix it with carriers, sometimes we sterilize it, sometimes we leave it on the shelf for a period of time. All of the things that we do in the processing of a DBM can potentially make the product better, or they can potentially make the product worse. So we have to control all of these variables sort of behind the scenes to make sure that we're optimizing our donor selection, we're optimizing our processing conditions to make sure that you have a quality product. If there's any knock on the DBM sort of marketplace or the products that are out there right now, it's a lack of consistency. And that's because not all DBMs are really treated the same. So moving on to clinical data. On the Accell side, we have a couple of small studies that collectively show a nice story. The most recent one I'm going to go into a little bit more detail was conducted at UC Davis. This was using Accell Evo 3, which is one of our Accell-containing DBM products, prospectively collected out to 24 months compared to infused patients that were retrospectively collected at 12 months as well. All of them had CT scans at 12 months with x-rays out to 24. So in a little bit more data, this was a 43-patient study. They were TLIF with posterolateral fusion. Importantly, the TLIF in all of these was local bone, and then in the posterior space was Accell Evo 3, the DBM I mentioned, or infused combined with local bone and cancellous chips. The Lenke grading scale was used for the X-ray evaluation. Glassman was used for grading fusion by CT. And the results you see on the right-hand side. When we looked at the TLIF and posterolateral fusion combined, 100% fusion in both groups. When you looked at posterolateral fusion only, the DBM group was 93.5% and infused was 100%. So very similar fusion results. Again, over about 43 patients. One of the big differences that we did note, however, was a larger rate of radiographic complications with BMP, and that notably being adjacent level fusions and ectopic bone formation in 1/3 of patients, which was very significantly different. Couple examples. These ones are both DBM, so you can see on the left-hand side a single level posterolateral fusion. On the right-hand side, there's an interbody at 3/4 that's fused, and then 2-level posterior fusion. Then infuse an example of some of the ectopic bone formation that we saw extending up basically a level in this case as well, and that was quite common and has been well reported as well. In terms of patient outcomes, you can see what was collected, back and leg VAS, SF12, ODI. All of these were very comparable. There's only one statistical difference, which was in the EVO3 group, the DBM group, there was a higher improvement in ODI at 24 months. But other than that, everything else was very comparable. So moving on to a couple new products, I want to describe the work that we've been doing and how we look at developing new biologic products. And because we are a spine company and spine surgeons are our number one customer, we really look at biologic products as part of a spine procedure. It's not just about talking about the 3 O's, osteoconduction, osteoinduction, and osteogenic, that every biologics guy like me talks about. That's one part of it. Having a very active product is obviously very important, but it's not everything. It also needs to work within a spine procedure, and that includes delivery, it includes completely filling the disc space, and it includes location. In other words, it stays where you put it. So one of our new products that we're just launching at the moment, which is getting a lot of interest, we set out about how do we make a great DBM better? We already felt we had great DBM, so to innovate off a low foundation is very difficult, but to innovate off a high foundation, innovate off a low foundation is easy, but to innovate off a high base is much harder. But we looked at 2 key things, and really this is not rocket science, but we looked at maximizing our activity. The way DBMs work is because of the DBM in them. So if we can pack more DBM into the same space, that's going to be clearly better. We're also increasing our overall donor quality, because as you can imagine, and this is a bit of a controversial standpoint in the tissue banking industry, but it makes inherent sense that if we are collecting bone from donors, right? Basically people who have died and passed on their tissue to us, there is a wide variety of health statuses of those patients. We know inherently we would rather get bone from a young, healthy donor than an old, unhealthy donor, right? That makes inherent sense, at least to me. That's not really the agreed upon stance of the tissue banking industry. And there's a reason for that, right? It's a little bit self-serving, but most people who donate their bones tend to be on the higher age range and generally not healthy, right? So we, as a smaller company, have the ability to be much more selective and optimize those conditions. Then secondly, when we look at procedural problems, the problem that we really identified are gaps, right? Gaps because end plates are not flat, and gaps because of the rise of expandable interbody cages. And that's really where this all started. When we try to develop a new product, we look for a problem first and then try to solve that problem. It stemmed from expandable cages that typically don't have a great ability to post-pack with biological material. So you put in a cage and you expand it up 4 millimeters. By definition, you've just created a 4 millimeter gap. Now, we know through basic science and biology that osteoblasts can't really handle or jump more than about a 1 millimeter gap. So if we create a 4 millimeter gap, that's a big chance for a non-union. And I've certainly seen a lot of CTs where you'll have integration at the lower part of that level and a gap at the top. And so why is that, even in a static cage? If you think about an ALIF or a lateral cage, it's essentially a flat cage that goes into biconcave end plates. If you have a 1 millimeter gap at the top and a 1 millimeter gap at the bottom, after the patient gets up, moves around, that starts to settle. Now you have a 2 millimeter gap at the top, and that could be a problem. So we should develop a product that helps solve that problem. So where we ended up with was a product called OsteoStrand or Strand Plus, which is based around demineralized bone fiber technology, incorporating our proprietary Accell technology that I spoke about before. Now, we're not the first company to have a fiber-based DBM, but I'll show you in a minute why ours is a little bit different. But these are the key features for developing this product. It has to be 100% active tissue, again, to maximize the osteoinductivity. If we believe the efficacy of DBMs is just good enough where it currently is, or maybe you would argue it's below where it needs to be, the way that we can increase that is by simply adding more DBM into the same space. Interestingly as well, there's data going back, and I'll show it in a few slides, that there are biological advantages of DBM fiber scaffolds compared to particulate-based scaffolds. The fibers themselves also give you good handling properties. They're moldable and cohesive with no carrier. So if you have carrier in a product, depending on the type of product that you use, that carrier can dilute your DBM. So yes, it will give you great handling properties, but after the carrier goes away, if there's 50% carrier in that DBM, you now have a 50% gap in your product. So just exacerbating that problem of gaps. And then the cool thing I'm going to talk about is we designed these fibers specifically to expand, to fill these gaps. So hopefully when I click this will give you an example. Here we took DBM fibers and just compressed them into a spine model. I'm just squirting saline on top of it now, and you can see it expanding back up to fill that space. Now in this case, we've really compressed it down to try to show you the maximum amount of expansion that you can get. You can get up to about 60 or 70% if you really compress it, but you can tailor the amount of expansion to make sure that it's controlled, right? Because we want these fibers to expand to fill those gaps, but not migrate out of the disc space. And the way that we do that is by creating these fibers that are really long. They're 30, 40 millimeters long, kind of like little spaghetti noodles, right? So the concept is compress it down like a spring. After blood and body fluids come in, expands up to fill those gaps without migrating out the disc space. And again, like I mentioned, it's not rocket science. It's take DBM, put more of it in there, and make sure there are no gaps. This is a study that was conducted back in 1999, so you could argue we were very slow to pick this up, but it's been known for a long time, the advantages of fiber-based particles, DBMs, compared to particle-based DBMs. And the reason is based on osteoconduction. So in this study, Scott Bowden's paper, what they did is they took DBM powder, they took DBM fibers, they tested them in their active state and then in their devitalized state. So in their devitalized state, it's just purely an osteoconductive matrix. What they found is DBM particles have no real osteoconductivity. The fusion in a rabbit spinal fusion model was 0%. When you do devitalized powder, devitalized fibers, the fusion rate was 35%. Then when you looked at them in their active state, it was 90% and approximately 60%. The difference between those two being roughly 30 or 35%. So what this tells us is in the fusion, about 35% of that performance comes from the osteoconductive nature, and the rest of it comes from the osteoinductive nature. So it's not just enough to be osteoinductive, you also have to have conductivity too, and that's what the fibers bring you. So skipping forwards to a recent study that we just conducted. You don't often see head-to-head studies comparing different products, but that's what we did in this case. We looked at Strand compared to Grafton, which is one of the leading DBM products. Also DBX Putty, Grafton and DBX are probably number 1 and number 2. And then another fiber-based product called Optium Putty. We looked at these at 4 weeks in a rat. The reason that we have to use a rat for DBM products is that human DBM, if you implant them into a rabbit or a larger animal model, you get an immune response, an immunogenic response cross species. So we have to do it in an athymic rat model. In this case, what we saw, fusion by manual palpation in the Strand group, 9 out of 9, DBX, 4 out of 8, Optium, 0 out of 8, and Grafton Flex, 7 out of 8. So you see a pretty broad range there from 100% down to 0%, depending on the product that you use. Looking at Faxitron high-resolution radiographs, you can see, again, we had 100% in the Strand group. Grafton also performed pretty well. The other two didn't perform up to expectations. But you can also see a pretty big difference in the amount of bone and the quality of bone between these materials as well. Just so that you know I'm not cheating, here's all of the 9 from our product, the Strand group. So some pretty impressive fusions for a rat. I know you don't treat rats here, but we're pretty excited when we see this sort of data. But since 2 of the groups performed fairly well, again, our material and Grafton, we took it one step further to look at the quality and quantity of the fusion itself, and we do this by micro-CT quantification. You can see what strand looks like, what graft-on looks like. And what we tended to see in the graft-on, if you look carefully, is that there were pockets inside the fusion where there are gaps. So that's what those arrows are pointing to, the voids inside the fusion. So when we quantify that by micro CT, we can look at overall bone volume, and we saw about a twofold increase in bone volume with the OsteoStrand DBM fibers compared to Graft-on Flex. Graft-on Flex is also a DBM fiber-based product. The difference is their fibers are really small. So like a splinter you would have got in your finger when you were a kid climbing a tree, those tiny little slivers, that's what they call a fiber, whereas ours are more like ramen noodles as a difference. And the reason for that, again, like I mentioned, is the handling properties, but also the osteoconductive nature. To us, it seemed to make more sense that a longer fiber would be a better osteoconductive matrix. We also did our own testing that I'm not showing here, where we looked at 4 different fiber geometries to select upon this one. We looked at long ones, short ones, skinny ones, wide ones, and we found that the long fibers tended to outperform the short fibers, and the narrow fibers tended to be slightly better for osteoconduction. The wide fibers were better for osteoinduction. So we move, biologics guy always has to throw one histology slide up there, and this is one of the ones that I'd love to kind of frame and put on my wall, but this shows you what a fusion looks like. And as I move to the next one, we can see the TPs down at the lower left and the lower right hand side, and then just solid bone bridging across from one TP to the next. It's about as good as it gets. This is a little close-up just to show you that it's true bone with marrow spaces, very healthy trabecular bone. So the key takeaway, the message I really wanted to get across was really twofold. One of them was to talk about the clinical value of this space in general, and especially as we start moving towards these cages that now participate in the fusion itself. Can we create a new sort of clinical paradigm that relies upon high-performing DBMs, which are much more cost-effective, 2 to 4 times less than some of the other products on the market, to still get the same or better outcomes with a greatly improved clinical value. And then just to show some of the new products to kind of hammer home the point that not all DBMs would classify as high-performing, right? We saw various results in a rat fusion model from 100% down to 0%. So your choice of DBM is important. Then this is my last slide just to highlight a couple other products that we've recently launched. Rapid is rack and pinion integrated delivery. So a graft delivery instrument. This is a sort of no-charge set that we provide that's designed to work with any mixtures of bone graft materials. It's not just specific to our products. Then Osteoballast, a new DBM material in a resorbable mesh. So again, trying to solve a problem, which is containment and delivery, this time specifically in the posterior lateral space. So for those cages where you're really concerned about biologics migrating, having a resorbable mesh made out of essentially vicryl suture could be a good option. So that is it. Anybody have any questions?
Great, thank you, Frank.
Thank you.
Great talk.